Hello, I'm Greg Barker. I'm the Executive Chairman of the N Plus Group and the co-chair of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, the climate initiative out of the World Bank. And I'm delighted to join this discussion on carbon pricing today in Glasgow. This morning, the veteran environmental columnist, Geoffrey Lean, who has attended many, I don't dare say all, but many of the COPs, and he's certainly a authoritative voice, in his column started to write about the sense of growing optimism here in Glasgow about the eventual outcome of this vitally important COP. Well, it's certainly too soon to declare victory or indeed call the outcome of this COP, but if you are feeling a sense of creeping optimism, I think one of the areas where we can feel optimistic is around the increasing recognition that carbon pricing has a key role to play in taking the world to net zero. Now, this isn't news. Carbon pricing has been around in the policy toolbox for as long as economists have been discussing the need to act on climate change. The CPLC was formed over 5 years ago at Paris. But carbon pricing still remains an underused tool, although pretty much all economists agree it is by far the most effective way of driving the transition to a low carbon economy. Now, why is that? Why has it not been used more in the past, and why is it more likely that it's going to be adopted now? Well, in the past, perhaps governments and politicians haven't been alive as perhaps they might be to the potential unintended consequences of carbon pricing, but also there haven't been the opportunities to mitigate carbon pricing with clean technologies that are competitive with the fossil fuels that they're driving up the cost of. That's not the case anymore. We all know now that the clean economy is changing at a fast pace of knots. Investment is pouring in. And so I think we are at a tipping point where governments around the world can use carbon pricing as a tool to drive forward the low carbon economy with increasing confidence. And they can look to examples, real life examples of economies that are doing just that. Whether that's Canada, Sweden, Finland, or others, there are now real-life examples of countries which are getting it right on carbon pricing and are increasing their ambition. What we need to make sure is that we are pragmatic and smart and see carbon pricing in the wider context of trade and regulations that form the wider ecosystem of policy tools that will help the world economy get to that ultimate net zero goal. And I very much hope today that the CPLC agenda of helping countries and companies adopt an ambitious carbon price to get to net zero will form part of this discussion, because I certainly think coming out of COP26 you're going to see renewed effort, renewed impetus, a new push around carbon pricing. But we don't want to have a mishmash, a jigsaw puzzle, a kaleidoscope of carbon prices around the world. I think there are currently 69 different carbon prices. What we need is a much more coordinated, coherent, joined up carbon pricing framework for the whole world to make sense of this very important tool and to ensure it's effective but also fair and supports a just transition. So I'm greatly looking forward to seeing what the other panelists here today can contribute to this increasingly lively and vital discussion.
Thank you very much, Greg. And it's really nice to see you again and so active on carbon markets. I'm chairing the first panel. I'm Arthur Runge-Metzger. And I think we are really following up from what Greg was just saying. What are the experiences around the world? And particularly now that so many countries have embarked on going to net zero, what is the role of carbon pricing going to be in the coming years? And I have a great lineup of very knowledgeable and well-known speakers. As this is a very, very short session of only 25 minutes, I'm not going to introduce them and their long biographies, but you will find them on the web of the side events. And also due to the short time available, I've been asking them to kick off the discussion with a succinct elevator talk. So 2 to 3 minutes in order to have maybe a few questions and discussion afterwards. And I'll start with Robert. Robert, what are the core elements and challenges for Poland in order to achieve the net zero target? What role is envisaged for carbon pricing instruments from your perspective as a researcher?
Thank you, Arthur. Hello all. It's a privilege to be in this lineup and discuss this enormous challenge we are facing all, which is the reduction of CO2 and being net zero in 2050. So we as a CAIC, Center for Climate and Energy Analysis, convened the analysis called Poland Net Zero 2050, where we see the decarbonization targets as it is in European legislation and the Fit for 55 package. And we find out that this is achievable with both technological progress in transport, agriculture, and industry, and adequate access to financial resources, which is crucial both from public and private sources. In case of Poland, most emission reduction, according to our analysis, and quite obvious, would take place in the energy sector, and with the reduction of fossil fuel use and increase of renewables share. But the role of this sector in the overall decarbonization efforts will decrease over time. The sector will be responsible for 80% of total emission reduction by 2030 relative to the 2015, and 55% of reduction by 2050 for overall economy, Polish economy. This implies the large share of reduction potential in the energy sector, and it will be utilized in the first transformation period with the following transition, which is relying on costly GHG mitigation option in industry, transport, and agriculture in the following period. So, of course, in the first place, we should focus on increasing energy efficiency, massive scale-up of wind, solar, and supporting clean energy infrastructure like grids and storage. But what is most important from our analytical point of view is seeing net zero transformation as a reduction of fossil fuel use and deployment of renewables, which is not sufficient to achieve climate neutrality in 2050, both in the EU and Poland. So we also need large-scale adoption of bioenergy with CCS, CCS, CCU technologies, electrification of industry, adoption of hydrogen technologies, spread of electromobility, and which is quite also important, the agricultural sector, which is very limited scale of reduction at the moment. So we need some new solutions and a mechanism in agriculture to reduce the emission, and so the reduction of livestock production, of course, is limited due to the safety, food safety. I think that from the role of carbon pricing instrument and the perspective of this instrument is enormous. As it was presented by Sebastian at the beginning, this is the solution that can be implied all over the globe, and it's increasing enormously in different regions. So both carbon taxes and emission trading system around the globe are speeding up. But I think it's still not, it's a small share of global emission which is covered by the carbon pricing in international level. But I think it's going to change in the nearest future. If we seriously want to, at the global scale, reduce beyond the net zero pathway. But if you look in the details, this is also not an easy task. And let's see, for example, the ETS that is the most advanced system worldwide, covering around 50% of EU CO2 emissions. And it's going to be changed significantly in the nearest future. And I think Vicky will elaborate on that in later. But the plans that for DTS are enormous. We are talking about the expansion of DTS for new sectors, transport and buildings, or introduction of the border tax, CBAM, as we call it in EU. And this carbon pricing will gain importance not only for the EU, but also for other countries. So this uniform pricing that we are covering more sectors and more sectors, also causing some problems because of the cost borne by different marginal costs for different sectors. So we have to also focus on that because it causes differentiation between countries and between social aspects, and so you have to also cover the supporting schemes for most vulnerable sectors and most vulnerable people. And I'm finishing. So CBAM is just also very popular, let's say, around the globe. It's causing, which is something which is also, let's say, future of deployment of carbon pricing. Because if we in EU want to cover our, let's say, protect our efforts within the EU, we have to take care of reduction the carbon leakage phenomenon. So at the same time, this even plans for presented by the Commission causes some action around the globe. So the actions are more focused on carbon pricing within the region that are also partners for EU, and they are trying to focus also on these countries to deploy the carbon pricing. So this is like I think first step for thinking on the global scale of the joining different schemes that are deploying around the globe. And what is also important, we at CAKE, we have a new project from Live Grant, which is called Live View 2050, when we continue to assess functioning of ETS and also its impact on interaction of other ETS and which are deployed around the globe. So I think it's one of the subjects that we will be focused on in not only we as a CAKE, but globally in the future, in coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I think that was a quite comprehensive view in terms of carbon pricing, even looking at some of the international aspects. But now I would like to zoom in onto some local.
Oh.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Catarina. I'm here representing CEA. CEA is a Center of Engineering and Development located in the city of Matosinhos in Portugal, and we develop new technologies, products and services for urban mobility to achieve carbon neutral cities, carbon neutral societies. We have been working with cities during the last 15 years, and we strongly believe that to achieve net zero, we have to actively involve cities, communities, and citizens. That's why at CEA we have developed the AIR platform as an enabler to create local carbon markets based on a local carbon price. AIR stands for Are You Ready? So the AIR platform is a sustainability acceleration platform designed to achieve net zero cities. The platform has 4 main functions. The first one is quantification. AIR platform quantifies in real time carbon emissions avoided by citizens using a sustainable mobility mode. And this quantification is based on international methodologies like the Clean Development Mechanism and the Verified Carbon Standard, but adapted to the local realities. And the digitalization of the monitoring, reporting, and verification processes is in fact an advantage of our approach. So first, quantification. Second, the creation of tokens. So the AIR platform is also the first worldwide platform that assigns a value to avoided carbon emissions, converting them into crypto tokens. So these tokens store the value of avoided carbon emissions. In fact, they store the value of our individual actions, because Air Platform empowers users, empowers citizens to fight climate change, making visible their contribution to climate change, their contribution to the decarbonization process. So, third, exchange. These tokens can be exchanged for green goods and services in a local ecosystem, for example, sustainable mobility services or even municipal services, rewarding citizens' sustainable behavior. So the tokens circulate in the local ecosystem as an eco coin. And fourth, these tokens can be used to offset carbon emissions in a local voluntary carbon market. Which is very important is that the credibility, the integrity, and the quality of carbon credits are ensured through the use of digital technologies such as blockchain and IoT, and also by the use of scientific methodologies. The local dimension is very important because we are talking about proximity offsets. So companies, local companies, purchase credits in the city where they are located, benefiting local communities. And the financial receipts will be used to finance other green projects, other mobility projects in the city. So just to sum up, rewarding non-emitters and charging emitters, we think that the Air Platform is contributing to accelerate the transition towards net zero cities. And we are implementing this solution in the city of Matosinhos in Portugal, where SEI is located. We are also implementing the solution in Brazil, in the city of Itajaí, and with the support of the European Bauhaus and Google.org, we are planning to replicate the solution in European cities, but also in other cities in Brazil and Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katarina. I think that was a very interesting experience, that kind of we can do carbon pricing not only at the level of nation states or regions, but even at the local level, and probably foster change much more quickly. Now I want to go back to kind of the eagle's view. Yang Qin, you are a carbon analyst, and you see carbon pricing across many different geographies. What role do you think will carbon pricing play, particularly in the developing economies? And here, of course, I'm looking first, and I think many developing countries are looking first at those who are part of the G20. How do you expect also the level of carbon prices to evolve in the different regions around the world? That is important in order to drive technology. Yang Qin, please.
Yeah, thank you, Arthur. Thank you all. So yes, I have the pleasure to discuss carbon pricing from the perspective of developing countries. Well, we all heard in the beginning, several new countries, they have announced net zero targets just in the past few days, just after COP26 kicked off. And carbon pricing will for sure be an important tool for them to achieve the goal. Because first, carbon pricing could internalize the cost of emitters and incentivize the investments into green and low carbon technology, because huge amount of capital are really needed for the developing countries to transform their energy system. And second, carbon pricing, especially a compulsory emissions trading scheme, could help the countries to build up robust emission statistics and accounting system, which is where they really often lagging behind developing countries. Well, considering G20, and I will really take China's new national ETS as an example. So it finally launched trading this year, really after a decade in the making. And China ETS covers only power sector at the moment, with yearly emissions of 4.5 gigaton. So that is 40% of China national total. And allowance price has been around 45, 50 Chinese yuan, so 6-7 euros. And this is rather low compared to more matured market, such as the EU ETS. but China ETS is being enhanced and will be improved and expand to more industry sectors by 2025. Talking about price level, shall we be worried about current low price in China ETS, and which might be the same as more developing countries adopt a similar scheme? I would think not. This low price at the start really reflects the low-hanging fruit and the rather cheap abatement options at present, which is often the case for developing countries. And in addition, we need to balance between reduction efforts and also the cost burden on the industry. So carbon price will be different across regions and jurisdictions and based on their circumstances. On a positive note, our team expect China ETS price to rise to 20 euro in 2030, and this level can almost double to 40 euro in 2030 if China ETS is tightened with an absolute cap in line with China's 2030 carbon peak goal, and also allowance auctioning should be gradually introduced. In addition, the ETS price will also form the basis for carbon tax, which might be a more suitable policy tool for some sectors. So I will conclude that from developing country perspective, there will also be regulatory measures such as coal phase out and car industry overcapacity. So there are really challenges to ensure synergies between ETS, carbon tax, and other energy policies. That is for regulators to consider. Thanks again. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Yang-Kim. I think that leads us straight to our last speaker, Vicky Pollard, because she will be talking about a much more mature carbon market. The EU ETS is in existence since the year 2005, and the ETS price hovers around 60 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. Vicky, what are the implications of that? And how do you think emissions trading and other forms of carbon pricing are going to be included into the EU's plan to get to climate neutrality by the year 2050? Maybe you can raise the curtain on that a little bit. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Arthur, and thank you very much to the previous speakers. As Arthur has said, the EU ETS has been in place since 2005 as a cap and trade system. So it sets an absolute cap on the emissions, and it sets a long-term perspective through a linear reduction factor. It's become more ambitious over time. It's been revised a number of times over time. What's important is that it's working. So first of all, it's working in terms of reducing emissions. It's about 42.8% emissions reduction in the first 16 years of its life till the beginning of this year. So it's an effective measure. And it's a measure which is being made more ambitious and expanding. So as Arthur said, under the European Green Deal, we now have in Europe an emissions reduction target for 2030 across the economy of minus 55%, as I think people know very well. And that means that under the European Green Deal, we've just adopted a package of proposals as the Commission for revised legislation, new initiatives to get us to minus 55% in 2030. One part of that is a revision of the ETS legislation. But I think it's important to note that the emissions trading system, the EU ETS, is just one of a number of measures. So the carbon price is there as a very important price signal, but it's not the only piece of legislation. And there are a number of other measures, be it targets, be it standards for specific products, which also imply their own implicit costs, which take us also to 2030. So it's the package which is important. In terms of the ETS itself, what we see is a very big reinforcement of the ETS. So whereas the current legislation for the previous target of 40% reduction by 2030 had a reduction of 43% in the ETS sectors to 2005, we're now talking about a reduction of 61% by 2030 for the sectors in the existing EU ETS. So a big increase in emissions reductions in the existing EU ETS sectors, and that's in practice means that the linear reduction factor increases from a reduction of 4.2% each year of the allowances available on the market, so that's up from a reduction of 2.2% under the previous legislation. So it's a very clear signal of the direction of travel towards net zero emissions. Also strengthened is the market stability reserve. So the system put in place to ensure that we maintain a balance between supply and demand when there are shocks on the market. Also, the allocation, the free allocation, is more targeted, and this comes alongside, and I think this is one of the important factors in terms of as we increase ambition, the price of EU allowances is rising, and it's important that we address the impacts of that increase in ambition in terms of the risks of carbon leakage. We've for a long time had free allocation targeted to address the risk of carbon leakage, of emissions reductions in the EU leading to emissions elsewhere. What we now see with this package is, for the first time, a proposal for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which is a proposal which would focus on 4 sectors initially, starting with a system of monitoring, reporting and verification, and whereby importers would need to buy credits from member states to cover the carbon content of imports. That would be linked to the price in the EU ETS. All of these measures, of course, are all proposals, so they're in co-decision, and it means that we're looking at start dates from 2024, 2025 onwards, when that legislation would be adopted according to the different provisions. What's also important is that the existing EU ETS will be extended. It will be extended to cover maritime emissions. So for the first time, putting a carbon price both on maritime emissions within the EU for larger vessels above 5,000 gross tons, but also for 50% of those journeys coming into and out of the EU ports. We propose to reduce the free allocation to aviation. But we've also learned from the experience in terms of the ETS and the importance of the carbon price. And there's also a proposal for an entirely new ETS to be applied to buildings and road transport, applied upstream to fuel suppliers. But this is very important because these are sectors where it's been very difficult to reduce emissions under the existing member state targets under effort sharing. And the carbon price provides an extra incentive, an extra message to all in the economy involved on the need to reduce those emissions, and an incentive to put in place the right technologies and solutions. Very important also, and the rising price also affects this, is the revenue generated from the ETS. So, of course, important auctioning revenues for member states, which to a large extent recycled into climate-related activity. But also there are a number of allowances set aside for different funds. The Modernisation and Innovation Fund, both of which will be increased under the proposals that we have, and so provide important support for the transition, along with other transition mechanisms in place, such as the Just Transition Fund. And the Buildings and Transport ETS, along with that, there is a proposal for a social climate fund to be funded by 25% of the revenues from this new ETS to be match funded by member states. And that fund is to support the most vulnerable. So those people who will have most to lose in terms of the transition, in terms of the initial investment needed to put in place measures to insulate homes, to move to low carbon or renewable fuels. it's also, for the first time, also an opportunity, a means of providing direct income support to the most vulnerable households on a temporary basis to address the impact that will have on household bills. There's just a few of the elements. This is obviously a day big package and there's a lot more to it, but that just gives you a flavor of how what we've learnt and the experience we have is feeding into the policy for looking to 2030. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I fear that this was a very slow elevator. So I think it's not going to be possible to continue with the discussion, but I think what we have seen and heard reflects very much on what Greg Barker was saying in the beginning, that the pricing systems are evolving very fast. New aspects are being added to that. And it can be done at the national level and particularly also at the local level in order to foster engagement and participation even of citizens. But of course, what it does to the whole system is it's going to be a fragmented system still. And people and countries are at different stages on the learning curve. So it's true, I think, what Greg Barker was saying, that there is a point in time when we need to start off how can this converge instead of embarking on battles on carbon leakage. So with that, thank you very much again for the speakers. And a big sorry for Luis, who unfortunately was not able to come in. But I think we all know your good work you do in Portugal on the Are You Ready initiative. Thank you very much. And I hand over to the next leader of the panel.
Very good. So thanks very much to the previous panel for their contribution to this discussion. And the starting point and the end point of that panel was that we have a very fragmented system. And so part of our work in the next session is to see what can be done to fix that fragmented system, or whether it can actually be just fine as it is. And so the title of this session is Rising to the Challenge of Net Zero. And so to get to that, we can use global carbon pricing, and Article 6, of course, has a role in that. And just by way of introduction, I'm Lewis Redshaw. The other Lewis was a speaker in the previous panel, in case there's any confusion. And I work at a company called Redshaw Advisors. I've been doing that since 2014. And our job is to help companies and people to understand carbon markets. And so hopefully I can help with that today a little bit. But I actually started trading back in 2004. I used to run an environmental markets business at Barclays Bank. And most of the work that we did there was related to the compliance markets. Now, compliance markets lock in a path to net zero. That's certainly what's expected of the EU ETS. But it's fair to say the EU ETS only covers around 40% of Europe's emissions, so we need to do something with the rest of that. And to do something with the rest of that, we need to scale carbon reductions and ultimately carbon removals considerably. And to do that needs a load of money. Now, I can say from my own experience that banks are shy of voluntary carbon markets, certainly historically, and the reason for that is there's no secondary market. That's changing at the moment, and we're starting to see the emergence this year of a reasonably liquid secondary market, but it's still got a very long way to go. And the main reason for that, compared to the EU ETS and other ETSs, is that ETSs, emissions trading schemes, have rules, and essentially there's one type of carbon credit. In the VCM, there are no rules. But curiously, the international focus has very much narrowed in on the voluntary carbon markets in the last 12 months in particular. Now, we've had the clean development mechanism in the past, and we've had a very big boom in that clean development mechanism, and then we've had a bust. So the reason for the bust is a lack of international ambition. So the question is the VCM, the voluntary carbon market, that it would appear we're all depending on, going to go the same way? And to make things a little bit more complex, as if it wasn't difficult enough in the voluntary carbon markets, there's quite a lot of confusion about carbon markets in general. We've come across companies that confuse compliance with voluntary, but there's plenty of disagreement about what should and shouldn't happen in the voluntary carbon markets. So with those regulated carbon markets covering just a tiny fraction of global emissions, so 40% in the EU, but it's an awful lot less in the rest of the world, the only game in town, it would appear right now, is those voluntary carbon markets. But the Science Based Targets Initiative have just said that they only expect people to have 10% offsetting with high quality removals by 2050. Greenpeace says we can't use offsets at all. And the expectation of the cost of long-lived carbon removals is that they're going to cost something like $100 once the technology matures. But the European market, the world's biggest and highest priced, only prices carbon at $70. And the European market is locked in to a net zero pathway. The voluntary carbon market, on the other hand, is somewhere between $5 and $10, depending on what voluntary carbon credit you're looking to buy. Now, I think I'm making my next point quite obvious with what I've said so far. The voluntary carbon market is getting all the headlines. Can they deliver without legislation? Can we actually decarbonize the world unless there's a mandate to do so? And perhaps adding to the confusion, the UK government have announced that they're going to force companies to publish plans for how they're going to achieve net zero. But the problem with it is there's no legislation to require them to stick to those plans. So those plans are going to be voluntary. So we are really very much focusing on how the voluntary market might be able to deliver. And I'm joined by an esteemed panel. I've got two people in the room with me. We have Andre Marcu, and we have Elizabeth Sturken, and remotely we have Dr. Shah Yu. So we'll get to each of those in a moment. We'll start with Andre, and then Dr. Shah Yu, and then we'll come back to you afterwards, Elizabeth, if that's okay. Andre Marcu, to my left, he's the founder, a member of the board and executive director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition, so ERCST. And I know Andre very well, so he's been in the carbon markets for a very long time, longer than me. I met him first in 2004 in his role at the International Emissions Trading Association, so there's probably no one with more experience of carbon markets and their history on this panel. And I'm going to start with you, Andre, and ask you, how realistic is it that we can achieve net zero with voluntary carbon markets?
Well, thank you, Louis, for inviting, and it's nice to be in the European Union side events, but make sure you know what you're asking, because you may get an answer. Look, I've always been much more involved in regulatory market, in compliant markets. It's just the way it has been. Voluntary markets in the past have been a relative sideshow, They've become an increasingly visible part of the conversation, but I'm not so sure that personally I welcomed it that much, and I understand it, and what is the longevity of the voluntary markets. Voluntary markets, at least in my mind, can play an important role at a certain place in time and in a certain set of sectors. And this may be one of those when there is a momentum and where companies are encouraged to do a certain number of things that society is not quite prepared to do. We are now in a point, if you want, where there are certain technologies that need a push. If you take CCS, for instance, its carbon price is not going to do anything for them, and they are critical. It's a technology is absolutely critical because there is no carbon neutrality without capture. And storage. It's absolutely not going to happen. But nobody is willing to pay that. So I think there is a moment in time where you can have companies taking carbon storage obligations, for instance, that are going to be costing 100 plus, but it is for a limited amount of time, and it is in order to push a certain technology. So there's no doubt about it, there is that particular. Now, you mentioned a number of things, the problems with the voluntary markets, and one of them is, I'm not as much in markets anymore as I used to be directly involved, but the velocity and the liquidity of it, I think I never thought of the carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets that are providing a price discovery. And you and I and Garth and others have had long discussion what is the role of the market. The role of the market, in spite of what everybody says, is to do price discovery. That's about all it does. And anybody says anything else, it has an agenda. So, does the voluntary market do some price discovery? Is doing some price discovery, but certainly not to the degree of that. The second thing is you're beginning to see an increasing number of sectors covered by regulation. And there's going to be very little that is left outside regulation. We're now beginning to see, there's proposed in Germany, there is transportation and buildings, and you're beginning to see it introduced at the EU level. There's an enormous amount of hesitation, and if you're a betting man, I know traders are actually no betting people. They're very, very calculated the way they do their investment. If you're a betting man, I think it's a 50-50 odd whether this is going to make it to the parliament and to the council. This is a very, very touchy thing. People are really, really nervous about the social impact of this. Is this right or wrong? And the answer is, in my opinion, it is wrong. Because if this is what the price is, then the people ought to know what the price is. And if it's very high, then we need to figure out a way how to deal with it. But there's another element, and the other element is the asymmetry of the Paris Agreement. Now, voluntary markets, if they start to get to high prices, which is what you need in order to do certain things, are not going to be able to benefit for any, you're going to call it, I don't know why you call it protection. The regulatory markets, you're going to give them free allocation. If you don't like free allocation, you're going to give them CBAM, a border carbon adjustment, as a punitive or as a cooperative manner. How do you do that in a voluntary market? You can do it at 5, 6, 10, 20, but 100 euros, there's going to be a very limited appetite for people to pay 100. So the need for regulatory markets that cover an increasing number of sectors, I think, is inevitable. We're seeing the intersection in one place is this Scope 3 emissions, where you see the intersection of voluntary and regulatory markets more and more. So I think that voluntary markets have an important element to play in this time and moment, but inevitably we're going to have to go to regulation.
That's very good, and thanks. And I find myself agreeing with all of those comments. As I've highlighted, that the VCM can't support if a compliance market can hit $70 and that causes companies to have financial difficulties. At $70, then $100, it's going to be pretty difficult to get people to volunteer to reduce their emissions at those sorts of prices. But I want to move on to Dr. Yu, who will join us remotely. So Dr. Yu is a senior scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and she holds a joint appointment at the University of Maryland. And her current research focuses on net zero transition pathways, carbon markets and industry decarbonisation. Dr. Yu, how much can we save by embracing carbon markets in addition to regulatory approaches in order to hit net zero?
Yeah, thank you, Luis, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I actually have a presentation discussing that question. So I'm a modeler, so I think the work we've been doing there is trying to quantify the role of carbon market in reaching net zero. And we started with like really modeling exercise to see what's a market value, what's the carbon prices in reaching net zero. We started analysis back in June. At that point, a smaller set of countries have set net zero pledges. So in the next slide, we will see assumptions that have been made about when different regions reach net zero. We made these assumptions based on net zero pledges and per capita GDP. In the study, we primarily considered two scenarios, independent and cooperative scenarios. So in the independent scenario, all regions implement their net zero pledges on their own. And in the cooperative scenario, which is named as with Article 6 in the next slides, all regions cooperatively implement their net zero pledges, and there is a global carbon market in place. We've seen a wide range of carbon prices across regions without a global carbon market, which creates room for trade. In a global carbon market, or the Article 6 scenarios named here, we see global carbon prices rise from roughly $60 per ton of CO2 in 2025, which is roughly comparable to EU price right now, to slightly over $400 per ton of CO2 in 2050. And cooperative implementation, or Article 6, can significantly lower the cost of reaching NDC or net zero targets. So the bars here show cumulative mitigation costs between 2020 and 2050 in NDC, the two left bars, and the net zero, two right bars scenarios. So just in short, it shows that global carbon market, or Article 6, can reduce mitigation costs by roughly $21 trillion between 2020 and 2050, and compared to like $13 trillion savings in the NDC scenario. So Article 6 or global carbon markets can really work to create the same level of emission reduction with a much lower cost. The question we'll look at in the next slide is that, what is the size of the carbon market? We see that the physical transaction peaks around 2035, 2040 at roughly like 4 gigatons of CO2, and then gradually declining to 2.5 gigatons of CO2 by 2050. So the physical trade volume diminishes as countries get closer to net zero because the remaining emissions are smaller and the cost differences across regions are narrower. But at the same time, average trade is more valuable, resulting in increasing in financial values. So the size of carbon market reaches roughly $1 trillion per year by 2050. And in this case, the buyers are mostly developed regions like US, Europe, or Japan, Korea. And the most sellers are the developing regions, as well as the regions with large land use potential. We will discuss the land use in the next slide. So what we've seen is that land use or nature-based solutions play a critical role in the global carbon market or reaching net zero. And when there is a global carbon market or Article 6 in place, that's the left chart, there's significant increase in land sinks compared to like no global market case, the right chart. This shows like there's going to be decreasing deforestation as well as increasing afforestation and reforestation in the earlier period when there's a global carbon market in place. And however, the role of forest diminishes over time as forest matures and there's only limited land to grow. But at the same time, we see the role of carbon removals, the blue bar here, including bioenergy with CCS, become increasingly important over time. So you do see this kind of shifting between nature-based solutions and carbon removals over time. In the next slide, we will see a shift in investment flows. So we see shifting capital investment flows changes from developed to developing countries. And so in this chart, It basically shows differences in investment in CO2 transportation storage with and without Article 6 or global carbon market in place. Anything greater than the 0 indicates increase in capital investment with Article 6 in place. Anything less than 0 indicate decrease in capital investment with global carbon market. So clearly it shows that most of OECD regions see a decrease in carbon transport and storage investment with global carbon market or Article 6 in place, whereas non-OECD countries see significant increase in CCS investment over time. And this basically just illustrates there's a really important trend like shifting in capital investment from developed to developing countries with global carbon market in place, which also creates additional benefits. Just kind of in the next slides, we really summarize what we find in the modeling study. So first of all, Article 6 or global carbon markets holds the potential to allow countries to achieve net zero targets with much greater economic efficiency. And as we see earlier in the net zero case, the cumulative savings in the next 3 decades is roughly $21 trillion. And second, carbon markets, although the physical volume decrease over time, we see increase in financial transactions over time, with the carbon market reaching $1 trillion per year by 2050. And third, there's definitely interesting dynamics between land sinks as well as carbon removal. Land sinks reports play a much important role in the near term, whereas I think carbon removal technology become increasingly important in the long run as regions reaching net zero. And finally, we do think Article 6 also have really important implication for both mitigation and sustainable developments. As you see in the previous slides, that capital investment shift from developed to developing regions, which also creates other co-benefits like improving air quality and other sustainable development metrics. So I think with that, I will turn it back to Luis, and thank you, everyone.
So the one thing that stuck out to me in particular was the $400 per ton. So there was me talking about $100 per ton, and it could be an awful lot higher. But what I take away from that also is that Article 6 would appear to need to be the glue that sticks markets together in order to reduce the overall cost, because at $400 that isn't going to be cheap. So on to Elizabeth Sturken at the Environmental Defence Fund. And Elizabeth, you direct the work of the EDF Plus business team, and you develop and implement projects with leading companies. And the one that that caught my interest in particular was the transform to net zero work you're doing with Microsoft. And the segue linking to $400 actually is that I've read somewhere that Bill Gates offsets his emissions personally and pays $400 a ton for doing so. Tell us more about your work, Elizabeth.
Well, I think the message really simply, it's short and sweet, is we're not moving fast enough, right? We need to reduce emissions in half in 10 years. And, you know, the regulated markets aren't cutting it. I think the voluntary carbon market can provide a really important venue to get dollars to important actions such as saving tropical forests, for example. And we see companies stepping ahead and wanting to invest and wanting to act now. Companies are data-driven, and they're good at innovating, and they're good at moving fast. And that's what we're seeing. And I think that is a really important piece of the puzzle. The truth is the time for long conversations is over. We really need action now. We certainly are optimistic that the negotiations here at COP will resolve some of the key questions with Article 6. But to be honest, we can't wait. We need to move forward. There are high quality carbon credits now that companies can invest in, and it really can be a real piece of the puzzle and a real path to cutting emissions dramatically in the near term. High quality carbon offsets are absolutely a great tool in the toolbox for companies to reduce their emissions, in addition to doing their own work to internally decarbonize.
Thanks very much. So my takeaway from this discussion, and unfortunately our time is already over, is that we're not going to hit net zero unless there's some sort of legislation. But international carbon markets are the way to reduce the cost of hitting net zero. And finally, that the fact that there's not legislation to mandate net zero globally has been very much recognised by companies who are very keen to do something but don't know what to do because they don't have the legislation to force them to do something, so they're acting voluntarily. So it would appear that the voluntary carbon markets have a role to play in the interim, and if they also cause Article 6 activities to be funded and got off the ground, then we may well be using the voluntary carbon markets to help with a long-term compliance market. So thank you very much to the panel. We've managed to squeeze that into a short time frame, and we'll hand back to the organisers. Thank you.